much for joining today's webinar, The Do's and Don'ts Delivering Feedback to Candidate and Employees. We're super excited to dive into this discussion with expert speakers from Lattice, Greenhouse, and Brooklinen. My name is Lauren Badamy, and I'm on the marketing team here at Greenhouse. I'm going to be facilitating things behind the scenes here today. And before we dive into the good stuff, I have just a few quick housekeeping items. First, you'll notice that in the console, there are some tech tips. So if you're having any video or audio issues, please check there first in case you can find some help. But in addition to that, just if you ensure your JavaScript and cookies are enabled, that should help make sure the video and the slide progression runs smoothly. Audio is through the computer, so if you're hearing me, you're off to a good start. We don't have a phone line for the connection today. And then all lines will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A widget. You can submit questions either of a technical nature, or we will have an audience Q&A at the end of the session today, so we'll be pulling questions from there for our speakers. And then lastly, we are recording today's session, which we will send out within the next hours, so you can have that for your on-demand purposes. Quick agenda. In just a minute here, we're going to start off with an audience poll just to test the temperature and see everybody's kind of familiarity with delivering feedback to both candidates and employees. Then I'll take us through our speaker introductions. And then they will take the baton and go through those do's and don'ts of delivering feedback. That should tee up the fireside chat with Brooklinen, and then we'll close out with that audience Q&A period. Okay, so quick poll here. We're interested just from everyone, where everyone is coming into the conversation today. So if you could take a minute to choose the answer that fits your organization best. Does your team or organization have guidelines or a formal process for giving feedback? So maybe you have a process for both candidates and employees and differentiate between those, potentially just on the candidate experience or experience side. Maybe you're kind of just doing your own thing from conversation to conversation, or potentially you don't know. So if you can go ahead, choose the answer that fits you best, and then make sure that you click that submit button so it's recorded. And a few slides here will share the results out with the whole group. Okay, great. So without further delay, let's go ahead and meet our speakers. Today's webinar is brought to you by both Lattice and Greenhouse. For those of you who may not be familiar, Greenhouse is a robust software platform that enables companies of all sizes to build winning hiring cultures. And they do that by driving great candidate experiences at every touch point, and also making sure that everyone on the hiring team is engaged and on the same page. And from Greenhouse today, we have Ariana Moon, recruiting manager, walking those do's and don'ts of delivering feedback from the candidate experience perspective. And Lattice, an integrated partner of Greenhouse, is a software platform that really enables organizations, forward-thinking organizations and people teams, to streamline their entire performance management process. And from Lattice, we have Head of Content Annette Cardwell, who will be taking us through the employee experience side of delivering feedback. And then last but not least, we have Jamie Pitcanix from Brooklinen, who's our VP of People. Brooklinen is a user of both Greenhouse and Lattice, and Jamie will be featured in our fireside chat today to help with understanding her philosophies and best practices towards delivering feedback. So thank you all so much for being here. We're really looking forward to hearing from you and getting into the meat of today's session. So with that, I will go ahead and pass the baton over to Ariana and Annette to take us through those do's and don'ts.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. I'm super excited to be here representing Greenhouse and excited to share a little bit about my experience discussing feedback from the candidate experience perspective. Okay, a quick agenda before we dive right into the various sections that we want to talk about. We do have 4 areas that both Annette and I will be addressing. So we'll start off talking about establishing the feedback process, then move into setting expectations for setting feedback, then making feedback candid and productive, and finally, what do you find the right time when you're delivering that feedback? Okay, so let's dive right in here. Lauren, do we have the poll results by any chance? Is that something that you're seeing on your end?
Yep, hold on one second here.
Okay. Great. I think everyone can see the results based on what was submitted of our poll. So again, the question here was, does your team or organization have guidelines or a formal process for giving feedback? It looks like a majority of the responses here, about 34.4%, was not really, I do my own thing, but I think a good amount of you do have a process for either candidates or for employees. It looks like about 20% said yes for both, which is really, really awesome to have. So I'm very excited to talk both from the candidate and employee perspective together with Annette in terms of how we do deliver feedback at Greenhouse and Lattice. Okay, moving right along here. So again, we're jumping right into the first topic of establishing the feedback process. There is one main thing that I would encourage people not to do here, which is don't just wing it. Let's make it a very intentional thing that we do. So when you're planning your feedback process for candidates, you want to start off by, especially when you're a recruiting manager running a recruiting process, holding your recruiters accountable to running a transparent and communicative interview process. So I think the key word here for me is really planning. You want to set the stage for being able to provide feedback well by intentionally creating this kind of transparency, this kind of communicative recruiting process for the candidates. So what that means to me is you want to be clear about what interview stages the candidates will be moving through, what the purpose of those interviews might be, who they will be meeting, and also you want to be able to communicate this to your internal interviewers who are involved. Another thing that I think about when I'm thinking about the feedback process is creating a system that's scalable, especially because a lot of the times on recruiting teams, we're running a lot of different searches. We're interacting with hundreds of different candidates. You want to make sure that there is consistency across the standards that you are holding when you are delivering feedback. So a few things that I chat with my team about is when it's appropriate to offer written feedback, when it's appropriate to offer feedback calls. So the way that we do it at Greenhouse is whenever someone enters our process and maybe they make it through the first initial stages, we will offer written feedback if we do decide not to move forward with them. And unfortunately, from the candidate perspective, it is typically negative feedback that I'm providing to candidates because it's the feedback that we haven't decided to move forward. The time that I do offer a live call to provide feedback is when the candidate has invested a lot of their time. Let's say they came on site for an interview, met with a lot of people. It only feels right to me that I would then get on the phone to discuss in more depth why we decided not to move forward. So that is how we approach it here at Greenhouse. And then finally, I think it's really great when you have, when you planned out a process for providing feedback, you're set up to do so well, but you also have to train your recruiters to have these kinds of conversations because often they're not that easy. I think constructive criticism, whenever a candidate wants to hear it, is really something I commend them for because it can be a little bit scary. And on the recruiter side, I think it's really important for me to train my team to be able to go through these conversations really. All right, Annette.
Sorry about that. I was having audio issues. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for having me on. We're really excited to be here representing the employee part of the conversation. So let's get into employee feedback because feedback is a huge part of why Lattice exists. It's a big part of everything that we do here. So we want to make sure, first of all, that feedback is happening. So planning your feedback for employees starts with making sure feedback is continuous. So the way that we do that is we want to make it part of every step of the performance management cycle. Feedback should be core to one-on-ones. It should be core to establishing goals. It should be core to your performance review. So at every step of the stage, everyone knows that they should be receiving feedback, giving feedback, whether it's manager or employee. So in other words, a bad annual review, what I'm saying here on the slide, should never be a surprise if this feedback is happening all the time throughout the process. The other thing to remember is that feedback should be positive as well as constructive. A lot of the time, employees and managers, they expect feedback should just be when you're screwing up. But that's a breakdown in the process. It shouldn't just be negative. The key ways to provide feedback are through those private conversations, but also occasionally public praise that sets a high bar, makes everyone in the organization feel better about giving feedback, receiving feedback. It becomes part of the company culture and raises the bar for everyone. Finally, the third is training your managers and helping them out by adopting a system for public praise. Oops, I went too far. So managers are your key deliverers of feedback. They deliver feedback in one-on-ones, in day-to-day conversations. They make sure they know what's expected. And so you want to make sure that they're well-trained and understand their role in your process. Also, to build a true feedback culture, you need to make sure that feedback is happening, so making sure it's easy for them to deliver it. So a system like Lattice, for example, gives structure to that conversation and to those ongoing conversations, helps nudge people to have one-on-ones, to give public praise, to seek feedback from others, to ask for feedback when they want it. So creating that system for them does help. Sorry, I realized that there was a build here. And I'm going to move on to the next one, which is setting expectations for feedback. And I'll hand it back to Ariana.
Thanks so much, Annette. All right, so the next stage of setting expectations for feedback, I'm going to approach this this topic from the perspective of if I were on the phone with a candidate, because a lot of the times that's when a lot of the expectation setting is happening. So again, like the main don't here is when you're on the phone with someone, like don't just dive right into sharing all the things that they didn't do well in the interview process. I think there is some expectation setting that you can do to try to make the conversation as productive as possible. So, I mean, the first thing that I will always do is I will thank the candidate for their time, because based on how we do things here at Greenhouse, if I'm on the phone delivering negative feedback to a candidate, they've opted into that conversation, which I think is like a brave thing to do, because hearing constructive criticism, again, can be a hard thing. So I will always want to go out of my way to say thank you so much for being willing to hear the feedback from my team. And I think that always starts the conversation on a good note. The other thing that I just want to remind everyone of is the candidates have invested a lot of time into your interviews too. At Greenhouse, on the phone with someone, it means that they've made it to the on-site stage, which means they've gone through basically the bulk of our interviews. They've come on site, they've prepared, they met a lot of people. So it's really important to me that like I acknowledge all the time that they've invested into us. So I do a few things to set context after I've greeted them, thanked them for their time. And these are a few of the things that I do. So one of the things that I'll always start off saying is, hey, I'm going to give you some feedback, and it's intended to be useful to you. I'm offering in this feedback in the spirit of being helpful. And I think just framing it that way can maybe kind of make it easier to hear. The other thing that I'll make sure to do is I will reassure the candidate, hey, you've done so well in our process. Like, not a lot of people make it to the on-site stage. And I want you to know that walking away, like, even though I'm going to focus on the stuff that could have been better, you got to this stage because you did really well. I may also share maybe how competitive the role was. So while I'm telling them, hey, you've done really well, I might even share it really came down to you and one other person, or you and two other people, so that they can have a scope of how much we really were considering their candidacy. And then lastly, I do like to give them insight into the decision-making process as much as I can. I'll talk to them about how I've had conversations with the hiring manager for the search, how maybe we had a roundup as an interview team to discuss everyone's experience of their conversations with them. And I think giving that sort of visibility into how the decision was made can help set a candidate's expectations of, okay, it seemed like Greenhouse took a very thoughtful approach to this. Okay, Annette, passing it back on to you.
All right, great. So setting expectations for employees and feedback, slightly different. The first thing that we always like to emphasize is that you want to establish goals for feedback. That helps create context for your conversations. One of the keys to effective feedback is making sure the recipient knows exactly what they're being measured against in the first place. So starting with the goals that you want them to achieve and using that as a touch point for conversations ongoing becomes a framework for performance expectations. Exceeding expectations will call for praise, obviously, and then obviously underperforming on goals could mean a tough conversation, but at least the employee always knows what that expectation is. And so hopefully that will allow you through one-on-ones to, manage that performance a little better from short time period to short time period instead of over the course of like an entire performance review cycle. Secondly, making one-on-ones core to your feedback strategy is pretty important. I've been pretty emphatic through the last slide to this one. One-on-ones are the easiest way to get your organization committed to feedback conversations. If feedback is continuous, one-on-ones are intended to be a dedicated time for that feedback. These discussions can be a great way for both managers and employees to talk about what is and isn't working for them in a partnership, and also a great time to discuss employee development, that their growth matters, all of that really important stuff that's emotionally important to employees. Thirdly, let me go. Sorry, I'm like figuring out my navigation here. It all starts with leadership modeling, the behavior that you want to see. So leaders and managers at a company should be active participants in whatever feedback strategy you've laid out for employees. The simple act of giving and receiving feedback, discussing it openly with employees through leaders at your company will provide that extra encouragement to your employees to follow suit, hopefully. Public praise especially goes a long way to helping show off that feedback culture at your company. So if someone in senior leadership is publicly praising employees or managers or teams, it's a fabulous touch point. Obviously, public ownership of mistakes and how to improve will also show that everyone in the organization has an opportunity to grow and improve. All right, moving on to making feedback candid and productive. I'll hand it back to Ariana.
All right, just going to do a quick comment. And I love what you said about being a role model for feedback, because that's something that I try to do, especially because I manage a team of recruiters. I try to hop on these kind of feedback conversations with them. That's really awesome. So step number 3, we're going to talk a little bit about making feedback candid and productive. And I think when we were discussing the content for this webinar, it felt really important to us to include the productive together with the candor, because I think a lot of the times when people think about candor, they think about just saying what's on their mind. But the thing that I want to emphasize here is, yes, but also make sure that what you're saying is something actionable and productive for whoever the audience is. So again, let's dig into what this means from a candidate perspective. The first don't that I want to emphasize here is don't beat around the bush. Like, I think the most frustrating thing is when someone's trying to deliver feedback to you and you don't really quite know what they're referring to or what they're saying because it's not specific. So the first thing that I think about is being honest but kind, right? It's that idea of candidness but productiveness. Like, let's focus on reachable improvements, things that the candidate can actually focus on improving. And another tip that I want to give my team is feedback on a technical ability is often a lot more actionable than feedback on, let's say, like an interpersonal skill. So an example there might be, instead of, let's say I had a sales candidate come on site and interview at Greenhouse. Instead of telling this person, oh, we didn't think that, you sold very well on the demo that we had you do, maybe I'll say something more like, hey, we decided to move forward with someone who had a little bit more experience when it came to complex sales within the SaaS, kind of like SaaS, in the SaaS world. So being specific on kind of the technical part is something that I do try to steer my team into talking about, because often that's where like the actionable stuff lives. The other thing, like I was saying earlier, is being specific in your examples. Again, I really think that fuzzy feedback is less helpful than no feedback at all. And it can also lead to a lot of renewed understanding. I actually had I had an interesting thing happen on my team when I was hiring for my team not too long ago. We had a finalist who we decided, unfortunately, not to move forward with at that time. And I provided some feedback to this person saying like, hey, we weren't actually sure whether this role would line up perfectly with what you were looking for. We weren't sure if you were actually excited about this role. And when I provided that feedback to them, they had the opportunity to tell me how they, in fact, were really excited, were really motivated, and why they wanted to be at Greenhouse. So down the road, we ended up hiring this person when the role opened up again because of that example and that conversation where I was able to be specific about that piece of feedback, which then opened the door for this person to share back with me their original intentions. So I think a lot of good can come out of that level of specificity. And then finally, one of the things that I think about when I'm delivering feedback is I do often leverage attributes that maybe other candidates may have demonstrated better than the candidate that I'm talking to in order to depersonalize the feedback. So instead of saying like, hey, Sarah, you did X, Y, Z, not that great, I might say something like, hey, Sarah, this other candidate that we met, we felt like demonstrated this attribute a little bit more thoroughly or more proactively than we would have loved to see from you, so that they understand that against kind of the other candidates that we were considering at that time, there are things that they did well, but perhaps there are things that other candidates did, a little bit more or extra that kind of tipped things over for us in the decision-making process. And doing so can help depersonalize. So it's not all about what they didn't do. It's more also about framing it from what they could have done better. Okay, Annette, passing it back on to you once again.
All right. So I want to first sort of talk about, obviously, tough feedback. What I like to think of it as feedback is a preventative measure. Honest feedback, I think, will save you headaches down the line. So we all hate having tough conversations, conflict. We're all a little bit conflict averse. But you have to think about it that way, that it's going to prevent a worse conversation from happening down the line. If feedback is already part of your performance management system, feedback will course correct, hopefully, an employee before the issue becomes like a full-on negative performance review. But it will help them hopefully grow, perform better, and it'll also help you identify if someone's maybe not in the right role, or maybe they're performing a job function that it's almost impossible for them to achieve in. So all of these things are a preventative measure, like I was saying, to helping you keep an eye on what's happening within your organization, and then obviously from having a tougher conversation later. Next, I think it's really important to give feedback in a very timely way, in real time as real time as possible. Basically, you don't want to let feedback build up until it's a surprise to the employee that it's a problem, or if you're seeming mad about the number of times that you felt like you didn't get what you expected from that employee. So it's not about issuing directives. It's starting with the problem that you can solve together. It should always be a discussion, but trying to give it in a real-time way is going to help them connect the two. Third, balancing tough feedback with praise. I just want to keep emphasizing constant negative feedback is a grind, especially if it's all that your employee hears. So balancing feedback that will help establish trust that you're paying attention to everything, not just the bad things, not just the things they're screwing up. And also, don't let your good feedback just be a way to couch criticisms. Just giving solid praise from time to time is important, but don't use good feedback to soften tough feedback. And then fourth, soliciting feedback for yourself. So your people won't take what you're dishing out if you're not asking for it yourself. So make sure you're asking your employees for feedback in part of your performance management system. All right, handing it back to Ariana.
Okay, thank you for that. And this is our fourth and final topic on the topic of providing feedback. So we're going to talk about timing your feedback conversations, which Annette just touched upon briefly. So again, from the candidate perspective, there is one main don't that I want to stress here and that's don't leave them hanging. I think you want to always treat people the way that you would want to be treated. And so when there is an expectation for a feedback conversation to happen, I think it's really important to action and act on that. Ask really promptly. So first and foremost, provide the rejection feedback promptly. And at Greenhouse, again, for anyone who's made it to the on-site stage in the interview process, we do offer a live phone conversation because we do want it to be two-way. We don't want it to just be us emailing things they could have done better to the candidate. We want the candidate to probe into our decision-making process and answer any follow-up questions that they may have. So, which leads me to my next point. Always leave room for questions. I think a lot of the times in our anxiety to provide feedback in a way that's productive, we might forget to ask, hey, is there anything else that I can answer for you? Or does this feedback even make sense? Like, does your experience reflect maybe what we're sharing in our assessment of how you did in our process? And then another thing that I always love asking is I ask candidates like, hey, what could we as a recruiting team, what could we have done better to make your interviewing experience better? Because I really do see candidates as kind of like my customers. We are providing this experience where they're getting to know Greenhouse. And it's really important to me that anyone who steps into our office, regardless or not, we decide to hire them, is walking out with a very positive experience with the people they've interacted with, a positive experience with my team, of the environment, of the office place. And I always want to know if we can be doing that better. And then finally, one thing that I can't stress the importance of, especially as a recruiting manager, is keep the door open for the candidates that you want to nurture for the future. There are a lot of candidates out there that maybe it doesn't make sense for your company to hire today, but it may make sense for your company to hire a year or two out from now. At Greenhouse, we're lucky to have an internal CRM as part of our product suite, so we do use that to help us resurface prior candidates that we've interviewed in the past, and it becomes a really useful recruiting tool. Also, maybe like you're nurturing them for the future, not just for your own company. I had something happen recently where I was looking for a coordinator on my team. And unfortunately, this person, we didn't move forward with them, but I really loved interacting with this person. And I helped them find the job that they have today by introducing them to a Greenhouse customer. And so just being part of like that and helping out in that way is also something that's very fulfilling for me. Even if I didn't hire this person for my own team, like how can I keep the door open and keep the conversation open in a constructive way to help people beyond just Greenhouse? Okay, Annette, back to you.
All right, let me go through this again. I think it jumped back for some reason. All right, giving timing feedback for employees. So I think I've said this a few times, but I want to just beat this drum again. Continuous feedback is ideal. So don't wait, keep it coming in one-on-ones, updates, praise. It should be throughout the process, not just twice a year or once a year when you do a performance evaluation. It helps to keep things from building up, getting worse. It also encourages top performers with praise to continue to do an incredible job and grow. And also, like I had said in the previous slide, being timely with comments and feedback are really important because then it helps reinforce good behavior, helps course correct bad behavior, and prevents misunderstanding, hopefully. Next, know your audience and deliver feedback in an appropriate way and time. So you want to learn your report's feedback tendencies and needs. Obviously, like we just spent a whole slide talking about candor, but sometimes you don't want candor to be the enemy of effectiveness. So learn those tendencies, tailor your message so it can be heard. Some employees are more sensitive and shut down to blunt conversations. Some prefer straight talk. Some prefer timing-wise to have it delivered in a one-on-one. Some want to hear things in real time. You want to be reactive and understand what those tendencies are so that you can deliver the most effective feedback message. And then finally, you want to plan some conversations around like specific scenarios that I sort of think of as red flag scenarios. They necessitate having a specific conversation, and some of those I've listed out here. One is an employee potentially has a lot of, is sort of showing having bad patterns or habits, constantly making the same mistake, or has a bad work habit, interpersonal work habit, you want to address that immediately and try and like work on a plan to improve. It's not necessarily a performance improvement plan, but it could be like just sort of like calling attention to that and making sure that they're aware of your bad pattern that you're noticing. Second, when they're struggling with a skill or unable to execute on a task, you want to get to the root of the issue, uncover a solution. So perhaps they were never properly trained. There could be a lot of reasons why those things aren't working out, but getting to that right at the moment when you're starting to notice that, you will help. And then thirdly, managing workload. So a lot of the time, if an employee is struggling, you want to just get at what is causing that problem. Maybe the workload isn't realistic, or they are strained and unsupported. Don't let them suffer in silence and ultimately burn out. Make that part of your feedback conversation with them. All right, and now we're moving on to key takeaways. Ariana, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Let me just make sure I am caught up from a slides perspective. Okay, I always find it useful once we just dump a lot of information to go over what exactly we talk about. So, Annette, I'll go through the first two, and then maybe you can pick up the last two. Does it sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, so remember, we talked about setting a formal process to train your team members. This was all about being intentional, kind of planning, so that you're just not rushing into a process haphazardly without having had the time to think about, oh, what would be the best process or format in which to have these conversations. Secondly, we did talk about how context is key, no matter the scenario. You know, from the candidate perspective, whenever I'm on the phone with them, I do a lot of context setting to make sure that when I do deliver feedback, which is sometimes hard to hear, it's received in a way that's most receptive as possible.
All right, and then third, balance candor with productivity was our third takeaway. So for candidates, obviously, like being open and honest will help improve the outcome, hopefully, and will hopefully keep your future candidates happier with you. For employees, we want to avoid tough conversations later, know what it is to get to your goal, whether or not you're an employee or a candidate. So the fourth one is prompt feedback is most relevant. For candidates, they want to know what's up as soon as possible, so be considerate and clear. And for employees, promptness helps associate the feedback alongside whatever you're providing feedback on. Praise in the moment is obviously awesome, but constructive in the moment in small ways may help guide them toward better outcomes. All right, handing it back to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Annette and Ariana. I think we're actually going to dive into our fireside chat now with Jamie from Brooklyn. So, hi, Jamie. Do you want to give a quick introduction on yourself, Jamie? And then, Annette, you can take it off with the first few questions.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm Jamie. I'm our VP of People here at Brooklyn. I describe my role as getting really amazing people in the door here and then setting them up for success once they are here. And hopefully they will stay with us and grow with us over a really long period of time. So feedback is super important, near and dear to my heart. I've been in the people world for the last 12 years or so. I worked for larger companies like JP Morgan, fast-growing companies. I was with Tory Burch for 4 years. And I also took a number of years to run my own business, which was a career development business where I actually worked with candidates to help them make their next job move. So in addition to having the perspective of sitting on this side of the table, I really deeply empathize with what candidates go through in the job search process. And I really try to bring that with me into my role here.
All right. Thanks, Jamie, for that intro. We're going to start off with questions about your employee feedback process.
Sure.
We've heard that you love to leverage feedback for good within your company throughout the employee life cycle. Can you explain to us what feedback for good means to you and to Brooklinen?
Sure. So I consider it my goal and the goal of my team to provide a really great work environment for people here. And that can mean a lot of different things. And as much experience as I have in this line of work, you might think you know what a good experience means to your team, but you won't really know until you ask them. So for me, when I say feedback for good, it's about really listening to my team and having a true and ongoing pulse on what they want and what they need and what will set them up for success so they can be happy and engaged and be here really doing their best work. And for me, we collect this feedback in all sorts of ways. It can be formal, like in the review process, or informal, like a focus group, for example. So we actually, or even a Slack to a few different people on your team who you think might have an opinion on something that you're thinking about. So one example is we just ran our mid-year review process a few months ago. I think we've probably run 3 or 4 formal review processes since I joined a few years ago. And I decided to call together an optional focus group of people who felt strongly about reviews and wanted to share some feedback. So we learned a lot in that focus group. We used it to improve the process, and then we made some meaningful changes. I also think when I take feedback from the team and make changes in a process and then are training our management team on it, they take it more seriously as well because they know it's actually coming from their teams, and this is what their teams want, not just what I think is, a best practice in a vacuum.
Wow, that's so interesting. I love that idea of like the focus group. Definitely think that I could see it like kind of gets buy-in across the company more effectively. So we spent a lot of time in our slides talking about candid and productive feedback. So among your team members, how do you encourage candid and productive feedback?
So this is tough, right? It's tough to give tough feedback. So it's tough to encourage people to give, tough, honest, meaningful feedback, and also bring awareness to how impactful really positive specific feedback can be as well. So the first thing for me, and you said this, Annette, is it has to be embedded in the culture. And everyone needs to know that this is a culture of ongoing feedback. You should feel free to share how you're feeling as long as it is kind and appropriate. And we try to encourage this as heavily as we can. So the first thing is, I think you have to ask really, really, really often if you want it truly embedded in your culture. So we ask for feedback from people after their first week, after their first month, every single week after that through weekly one-on-ones with managers, and then again in both our mid-year and year-end review processes, and then informally through Slacks, focus groups, polls. We really try to ask for feedback all the time and lead by example so other people feel open to giving it and also receiving it. I think the second thing is, if you're going to ask, you better be open and not defensive when it's given to you. I mean, the one thing that's going to make your team stop talking to you and telling you how they feel is if you respond to their thoughts and feelings with an attitude of defensiveness or telling someone they're wrong or immediately jumping in with your opinion. So it's about really training that behavior of openness in our management team and frankly everybody on our team. And then I think the last thing is you have to act on it. If you ask for feedback all the time and you don't do anything with it, people will also stop giving you feedback. So really taking that feedback, putting it into action, and then when you make changes, to actually say, hey, this change is coming as a direct result of whatever the forum was where you asked for feedback.
Okay, fabulous. Closing that loop is pretty key, I think, to making people feel like they're being heard.
Otherwise people will give you feedback a few times and then never again.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about peer-to-peer and manager-to-peer feedback. how do you encourage peer-to-peer or manager-to-peer feedback rather than coming to HR to get involved? Because a lot of the time, people want HR to come in and be the referee and sort of manage the process, especially when there's tough conversations involved. But so how do you encourage them to sort of solve their own problems, for one? And then what's the point where HR should get involved?
Sure. I think it goes without saying, but everything I'm about to say refers to issues that are not sensitive, or not sensitive in the way that it would be appropriate for me to handle them versus a direct conversation. So just let me preface everything by saying that we've been talking on our team a lot lately about this concept of triangulating. So that's sort of like this triangle where there's the person who has the feedback, the person who needs to get the feedback, and then often me, but sometimes another coworker as well. Someone who's maybe not as close to the situation you're just venting to, or you're sharing your challenges. And really what happens when someone triangulates your feedback is that they will deliver it certainly less effectively because it's going to be either watered down, not as you intended it, or, it's like the classic game of telephone. That's kind of what happens when you triangulate feedback. The other thing that happens is the other person who you probably have a close working relationship with feels a little bit betrayed because now I, as the kind of people person, I'm coming to this second person and saying, this is what this other person came and said about you. And anyone who's ever found out that someone's talked about them behind their back knows that it doesn't really feel good, even if it's fair feedback. The minute I'm delivering it when someone else told me it's not a direct conversation, it's already setting up that feedback to not land as successfully and impactfully as it would otherwise. So, it's kind of a running joke on our team now. Sometimes people will come to me and they'll be venting or expressing some frustration about, a process or, a relationship that needs some fine tuning, right? This happens in every work environment. And the first thing I say back is, well, what that person say when you told this to them? And we laugh about it. And they're kind of like, all right, you're right, I know. And so I consider my role as kind of the lead of our people team to coach people on how to effectively have that conversation directly, because everyone knows it's going to be more impactful if it can happen, but it's uncomfortable. So the more you prepare for it and get guidance and maybe even role play if it's a really tough one, the better your working relationship is going to be. And, I think another thing that's really great about our culture, and I don't take this for granted, is that everybody here is here to serve the same goal, and we all, our hearts are in the right place, right? So if something's coming up that's a little bit of a conflict, I think everybody knows there's positive intent behind kind of every side to the story. It's just different people have different working styles, different teams have different goals, and so everyone sees this as a avenue towards a solution and I don't know, improving on that relationship.
Love that. All right, I'm going to let Ariana hop in here. She has a couple of questions specifically about feedback for candidates.
Yes. And Jamie, I love what you were just saying about triangulating and role playing. I think those are all really key things. And then tying it back to, hey, like we're all trying to achieve the same thing. One of the things that I often say to my team is if they come to me is I'll ask them, well, can you tell this to that person you're talking about in the way that you told it to me? And that act of role playing is really helpful because sometimes people just need to bounce off their thoughts of how they're going to deliver their thoughts to someone else to you as a manager. So I love what you said there.
For sure. And I think when you separate the piece of feedback you're giving as just something that happened versus something personal about someone, it really takes it takes the emotion out of it and makes it really, really objective and not as scary.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of scary, one of the questions I had for you was, delivering feedback to candidates, not employees. So from a candidate perspective, can be scary because often it is more of a one-off thing, and often your relationship with a candidate is not as deep maybe as a relationship with a current coworker. So the question that I had for you is, given that, how does your approach to delivering feedback differ when you're delivering feedback to a candidate versus to an employee?
Sure. So you touched on this before, Ariana, but I think that, yes, the approach is certainly a little bit different. And I think the deeper the candidate relationship and the further along they have come in your recruiting process, the more time they've spent and invested in you. And I think that it's only appropriate that at that point you invest some significant time and effort back. So while candidates might not be, they may not be your employees, they've really invested a lot in the process. So I do believe in ending that relationship on a high note and being as helpful as possible, because like you said, just because a candidate doesn't work out for the role that you're hiring for right now, doesn't mean they won't be right for a future role within your current company, maybe, years down the line in a different company. Recruiting is all about building those relationships. And when you run a fair, competency and values hiring process, none of the information that you're giving should feel personal. It's not. It's all about, who is the best person for this job and who approaches their work in a way that's going to be in line with our company and our growth stage and our business needs. So, we do give feedback in the process, and it is a longer, more personal conversation the more time that person has spent with us. I also think it's overlooked, but I actually think it's equally important to give feedback to the candidates who get the job during the offer process, in terms of, why did the team choose them, and why do we as a full hiring team specifically think they're going to be successful in the role and be amazing at it? Because this gives your top candidate, while they're making a really, really important decision in their life, it really makes them understand how thoughtful and deliberate your process was, and that you have not been taking this decision lightly. It's a big deal, and you have so much confidence that they're going to succeed at your company and in the role you've chosen them for.
Yeah, I love that you said that about delivering positive feedback for the person that you decided to move forward with, because that is absolutely something that we do here at Greenhouse. It's super important for people to know why they were hired. It's not a part that I touched upon in this presentation, but it is totally a topic I feel like we could talk another 15 minutes about. And even when I've made offers to people on my own team, I've also been candid to them around hey, these are the ways I think you can grow too. So it excites them in terms of this is the training and resources I'll get at Greenhouse, not just only focusing on the stuff they did amazing at. And then one final question. I know we're getting close to time. So final question for you, Jamie. What are the guidelines that you use or expectations that you might set when delivering feedback to candidates to make the feedback most helpful to them?
Sure. So the first thing that I feel really strongly about, whether it's, on a phone call or in an email, is I like to come right out with the hiring decision first and foremost. There's nothing worse than someone telling you all the things you did well and then some things that would be great for your development, and they're kind of where is this going? Where's the butt? Where's the other shoe gonna fall? And did I get this job or not? So before going into any of the feedback, I do like to just get right out there and share the decision first and the feedback next. The second thing is I want to be as candid as possible and give the real reason that they're not moving forward. Sometimes that reason is not that satisfying, admittedly. It's just another candidate was better aligned with the qualifications of the role. That's not that deep, but sometimes in a competitive process, that's the truth. So I think if you're telling the truth and you've run a fair interview process, then telling the truth is the best you can do. I also think that it's important to make it developmental, right? It's not about just this interview process and what they should have done differently. It's okay, you're out on this job search and you're looking for your next role. It's a really important decision. If this is what you're targeting, here are the things I think you could do a little bit differently next time. And then the last thing is I try to instill this in my team as well, is this is the best practice for giving any feedback, but especially to candidates where you only have a few hours of data, right? You don't know this person completely. You've spent 3 hours with them, in a room, maybe collectively with your whole team. So I'm not going to tell someone, hey, you're not interested in X or your goals are in X. I would say, during the time that we spent with you, this didn't come across, because, all I have is the data that I have, and that's what I'm going to give the feedback on, versus making a broader generalization about someone's, experience or passions or, anything else.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us from both the candidate and employee.
I'm sorry to move around. I'm going to plug in my computer so we make sure that this lasts the rest of the webinar.
Sounds great. I think we're passing things back off to Lauren.
Yes, great. Thank all three of you, Annette, Ariana, and Jamie. That was a really insightful discussion, and we had questions coming in left and right for you guys. Really fantastic questions are actually still coming in. So I would like to take maybe 5 minutes so we can there was a couple themes that came through pretty strongly for each of you. Before we do that, I want to take 30 seconds here for a quick poll for those of you on the line to understand what your next steps are. Perhaps you're new to Greenhouse or Lattice and would like a demo of one or the other. You can select multiple choices here. If you're a customer and you want us to put you in touch with customer service rep for strategies or any questions you have, we're happy to do that as well. So please go ahead and select the answer that makes the most sense for you, and I'll leave that up for a couple of minutes. For audience Q&A, I'm going to try to direct one question to each of you for candidates, employees, and then Jamie, kind of a thematic question. So let's actually start with you, Jamie. We got a question here for you that says, Jamie, you mentioned the importance of having feedback embedded in your culture. How can a medium-sized organization go from almost zero feedback to having feedback embedded in your culture? Any thoughts? Do you still have Jamie? Frozen. Okay, well, Jamie might be frozen, so we'll go to our next question here, which is for Ariana. We got this question from multiple people, and that is more cultural based than technical. They might have all the right experience and all the right skill sets, but really culture is the main issue.
That's a really good question, because I think this is something that does happen a lot in the interview process. One of the things that I'll go back to talking about is the approach of maybe focusing on the things that other candidates have demonstrated better throughout the process. I think a lot of the times, when it comes to cultural values, it can be encompassed in how someone answers a specific question. So being candid may be about how, hey, like we decided to move forward with other folks who we felt were able to better demonstrate our values based on our ability to assess that attribute, is something that, I've definitely had to say in the past. And it's a harder conversation to have because it is less of a technical thing. But again, like I will try to talk a little bit more about what other candidates did better. And then I will also try to talk a little bit more about, or articulate that, we are self-aware in the sense that based on what you were able to demonstrate, this is what we think, instead of saying you are not X, what Jamie was saying earlier. So again, making sure that you articulate to whoever you're delivering feedback to, that you are going off of a very structured process is something that I try to be very open about. Like, we're not perfect at Greenhouse when it comes to interviewing, because we're human too. We have our own levels of unconscious biases. And I think articulating that self-awareness back to candidates when you are delivering feedback is something that can make the conversation more accessible. Hopefully that helped answer that question.
Awesome. Yeah, great points. Thank you. Our next question, let's see here, is for Annette. How do you get managers to understand how important ongoing feedback is for helping employees? And for those managers that it may not just come naturally to, do you have some kind of specific training for providing feedback or ways for encouraging that process?
Well, here at Lattice, we definitely do, because like Jamie was saying, we have a culture of feedback. We make it core to who we are as a company. It's super important to us to show off feedback even. So we have, like we're about to roll out a new feature called Praise Wall that allows people to display public praise in a very public setting. So on a screen in a common area at a company. So starting with that culture of feedback, we establish a lot of our management training, management discussions as a group around that feedback being central to what we do. And so part of it is through modeling, like what I was saying before, like if it starts at the top and trickles down, it helps encourage people to see feedback in action. Encouraging those managers to ask questions, to raise their hand, to seek out resources from HR, from our people team. So it really has to begin with that culture of feedback. And Jamie, you may have some ideas around this too. If you sort of build that into the backbone of your performance system, it becomes a lot easier for people to see it day to day to day, and then it becomes a little bit more natural.
Yeah, that actually is a great segue to, I think, Jamie, the question you might have missed, which is all about, you mentioned having feedback embedded in your culture, but if you don't already have that process in place, how do you go from 0 to 60? How do you get to a culture that has feedback embedded?
Sure, that's a really great question. I think you have to start somewhere, right? You can't just go from 0 to 60. So I think taking some early small steps are great, and then you can kind of keep dialing it up and asking for more and more and having more processes around it as people get more comfortable. So in case examples are helpful, I can just tell you a few things that we did here that had a very positive response. So number one is we do use Lattice, and Lattice has a really great feature that's called updates. And basically every week, everybody on our team gets an email that basically says some version of, 4 or 5 short questions. How's it going this week? What was great? What's been challenging, and how are you feeling overall? And we structure this email to go out a day before each manager has a one-on-one with their direct report. So you can customize when it goes out. So it's really timely. Most people do their one-on-ones towards the end of the week. So maybe the Lattice questions will go out and get answered on a Thursday, for example. This is great because I think it gives a really safe and regular vehicle to give small feedback before something becomes such a big issue that it's really hard to share. I think when you're just asking someone, hey, how's your week and what's been challenging, they will tell you. I find it amazing that if you want to know something, like just ask and then be quiet and listen, and you will get so much more information than you think. So first of all, I think people are comfortable talking about their own challenges, especially if they know you're open and they know that your response is helping them work through that. So that's one thing that was really easy to implement, and people really took to right away and really appreciated it. There are, other things we do in smaller ways to create a culture of feedback. For example, when we're choosing what our next team activity is, we might throw a poll in the Slack and ask people to either, vote on their favorite choice or recommend places, right? So that's not tough feedback. That's just brainstorming and actually engaging the team on things that are really positive to talk about. And, on that note, you can encourage managers and team members to give each other really positive feedback after they've done something well. Everyone always feels good about starting out with that. So you sort of, I think that it's two-pronged. I think one, it's giving the right vehicles for people to share that feedback in a safe way, being open, and then also creating feedback opportunities and getting people used to giving feedback when it's positive and not difficult. So then when there is something more difficult to deliver, they've practiced that skill.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you, Annette and Ariana, too. I can't thank you enough for this great, insightful discussion. We're right up against time here, so we'll say our goodbyes. If you do have additional questions, you can email us at the address that's on the screen. We will be trying to get answers to all of those questions that weren't addressed today and following up via email and a blog post, so please stay tuned for that. And then lastly, quick plug, we have some resources with blog posts from Lattice and Greenhouse on the subjects of delivering feedback in the console, so check that out on the right. And then you can also register for next week's webinar with Hired on employer brand if you are interested. So thank you so much again, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.